Well, thank you very much for having me here, and I'm very pleased to talk about this subject. As I was driving down from Santa Fe this afternoon, I was thinking about an event that's occurring in Santa Fe next month, and it's the Fred Harvey weekend. And it's a big deal in Santa Fe, and they have dinners and speakers and all kinds of things. But one point occurred to me that these guys were the wind beneath Fred Harvey's wings, and anything else that had anything to do with transporting material. And there were a lot of Native American people, as well as Asian people, Mexican, Anglo, Irish. Everybody worked for the railroad, it seems, at some point. And the reason that I picked the Navajo and the Laguna and Acoma people is primarily because their history with the railroad goes back to the 1880s. And the other thing is that as a nation of people, they have very distinct and different relationships with the railroads. And I'll get into that. If you have any questions, I would appreciate it if you could hold it till the end, and then I'll answer questions. What I'm going to be talking about are really the Navajo experience and the Laguna experience, but there were some commonalities as well. And they were that there were early expansions of rail in New Mexico, and the point was to get through New Mexico. In the 1880s, most of the railroad companies, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, the Southern Pacific, Union Pacific, and then several others, viewed New Mexico as a place to get through rather than to. There wasn't a whole lot of freight to be got in New Mexico at that time, and most of the railroads, frankly, were trying to either go south to connect with the Republic of Mexico or to get as far south as Rincon and then turn west towards Deming and California, where the business was. This is just a picture of one of the track crews, and they used things that looked like tongs to lift rail. And most rail was about 39 feet long, and it was 39 feet long because the cars they transported it on were 40 feet long. And that gave them 6 inches on either side to transport it. I'll get into more detail on that later as well. Let me just show you what New Mexico's rail system looks like today. There are 11 railroad companies. There are 2,500 miles of track in the state. That's about the distance from here to Miami, Florida, is contained with active rail lines in New Mexico today. We have 126 million tons of freight that move annually. There's a lot of money involved in this. There are over 7,000 people that are involved in the railroad industry. And let me just give you an idea. I think you can hear me without the mic too if I move over here. But the red line used to be the Southern Pacific. That line was absorbed by the Union Pacific in the 1990s. And it runs from San Diego down to El Paso. Then it comes up from El Paso, goes through Alamogordo, Vaughn, Santa Rosa, Tucumcari on its way to Kansas City. The green line used to be the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company. It was having similar financial problems in the 1990s and was absorbed by the Burlington Northern, the system now being the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway Company. And it's the green line that goes from, well, it keeps going after Raton, but then comes through the state, runs down through, goes out through Gallup, and then it branches off at Belen, goes south. So there's a lot of traffic on that line. We have a number of short line railroad companies in the state as well. And their job is to move freight and other materials and give it to the larger, as they're called, Class 1 railroad companies, and move both freight and passengers doing that. The Cumbres of Toltec Scenic Railroad up at the top is jointly owned by the states of Colorado and New Mexico, and there are a total of about 64, 65 miles of track for that one. Another interesting and more recent railroad is Sky Railway, and that operates on the Lamy branch line from Santa Fe down to the community of Lamy. That is a fantastic little 18-mile stretch of track for several reasons. The primary reason I think it's interesting is that Lamy line that runs from Santa Fe down to the main line at Lamy is really a microcosm of New Mexico railroading history. It has been up for sale several times, and just at the last moment, somebody has stepped forward and offered to purchase it, and have kept it running for a few years until they got tired of it or it was starting to lose money. Then it was on the auction block again, somebody else stepped forward to it. So it's almost a phoenix-like representation of railroading in New Mexico. I have a picture, but not in this presentation, but in one of the other ones that I give, that shows the Lamy line going south, and it's got wooden ties, jointed rail, and it's going under I-25 in Santa Fe. Right next to it is the Rail Runner line, and it's moving out and it bends to the right, and that line has 136-pound welded rail, concrete ties, and it's very well ballasted, and you can tell a lot of money has been put into that line. But it's the only place that I know that you can actually put one foot in the 19th century and the other in 21st. For most historians, it makes our socks roll up and down. It's really cool. So that's what we've got today. All of this stuff, as I said at the outset, it wouldn't happen. The Santa Fe Railway Company in the 1930s and 1940s, when it was promoting its passenger systems, had posters like this. Little Navajo boys dressed up, watching for the famous chief trains. They have other posters with a Native American with a big headdress. It's all marketing and selling the Southwest. And this is one of the engines that was used during that period. And the Fred Harvey weekend has been an important event in Santa Fe for several years now, and it's still going on. I think all of that is contingent upon the work of a lot of the railroad workers. Most of the railroads that operated through Arizona, New Mexico, California relied on laborers that were next to the tracks or close to it. And that's why so many Native American groups have worked for the railroad at some time or another. It's also true north of here, in Colorado and in the Dakotas and in Montana. It was a ready supply of workers. The green line is the Santa Fe Railway main line. And while there were other railroads that also employed Native Americans, I'm going to focus on the AT&SF, or the Santa Fe line primarily. But you can see the volume of ready-made workers available to that company, so it's no surprise that they utilize that. Yes, sir. This is something you may remember from high school civics or your history books. It's Manifest Destiny. And Manifest Destiny is portrayed as a woman moving west from the Mississippi River toward California. It's no accident that it's dark in the west and very light in the east. And she's not only leading the railroad, but she's leading stagecoaches, covered wagons, people on foot, horses, and all kinds of other things, because the promise was the west, and that was also echoed by the territories that were in that area as well. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway had its own view of Manifest Destiny. It was sort of like the one that the slide that I just had, but it shows a star being pulled by the AT&SF Railroad Company. They were doing it all. They were doing a lot of it, and the Santa Fe Railway had no qualms about promoting itself. This is what track construction generally looked like in the West during that era of railroading importance. Keep in mind that railroads were the space program of the 1880s. They changed everything, from laws to the transport of natural resources and people. Even architecture was changed by the railroads. There was very little that wasn't. The part of the tracks that we're interested in will be the line running north and south out of Albuquerque, as well as the line running from Albuquerque west, and that at that time was known as the Atlantic and Pacific Company. These railroads changed their names during different periods of time for different reasons. There were federal laws that were very important for the railroad companies, and there were territorial statutes too. The territorial statutes related to economic growth, more population, homesteading. New Mexico desperately wanted to become a state, and it would only become a state if it had a railroad. The railroads were not particularly interested in New Mexico, so there was a lot of discussion about that happening, but eventually it did, although it wasn't until after all the states around New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Texas, any other state too, had railroads before we did. The railroad came relatively late to New Mexico, came in 1878. The Pacific Railway Acts were more than one act. They were a series of railroad acts, and they were signed by President Lincoln, and the whole idea was to pour federal money on opening the West. And that was really done for several years, and this was during the Civil War. The Second Transcontinental Railway was formed, and that was in Deming in 1881. A lot of people wonder why the railroad didn't go to Santa Fe. If it was called the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company, why didn't it go there? There's a reason for that. Even in the 1880s, the town of Santa Fe had a mystique to it. People thought of it as being a romantic location, that it was read about, but very few people had been there. And the railroad at that time was trying to promote itself also. So it added Santa Fe to its name to represent its desire to be developing interests and financial promotions in the West. When they got there, they discovered several things, and I'll go into that later too, but there wasn't any business in Santa Fe for the railway company, and the rail line was not worth building because there was a substantial raise in elevation to get up to Santa Fe from the main line. There was no economic cause to go to Santa Fe, and on that line that is finally built, the Lamy line, there were a lot of bridges and a lot of curves, making it extremely expensive to maintain, and it still is today. That Lamy line has 19 bridges and 55 curves on it. The last thing railroaders want on their line are curves and bridges because they're expensive. Every time you go around a curve, it pushes the outside rail out. Every time you go over a bridge, it loosens the timbers. Lots of money involved. So that's originally why the railroad didn't go to Santa Fe. They built the branch line because Archbishop LeMay and several important territorial legislators wanted it built, and they kept pestering the railroad to do it. The railroad was interested in moving south to the Republic of Mexico, so they finally negotiated, and for $150,000, the Santa Fe Railway built the branch line into Santa Fe. There was another thing that the Pacific Railway did, the Pacific Railway Act did, and it said that the United States should extinguish as rapidly as may be Indian titles to land falling under the operation of the act and required for the railroad right-of-way. As a result, the Dawes Act was passed and several other acts that usurped Indian land and made it available to Anglo settlers. And it was cheap land, good for farming, whatever you wanted. And the idea was to take those rights away from Native Americans so that not only railroads could go through, but towns could be developed and another number of other things that promoted the national interest. The territory of New Mexico had laws very favorable to the railroads as well. And what those laws were, one was that the railroads could take, possess, and enjoy any such materials, springs, water, as may be necessary for its use and purposes in operating its railroads. Free water. The other thing the railroads could do is to either purchase or just take by its engineers or surveyors property that was needed for the railroad, that was convenient for the construction and maintenance of the operation of its railroad and telegraph lines. I highlighted the part that says, take any property as its directors may deem necessary. Not as the citizens deem necessary, not as the governor deemed necessary, but as the railroad deemed necessary. And those are territorial statutes from 1878. The other thing is the railroads were exempt for a period of 6 years from paying any taxes. That was a further incentive to get the railroads to come. And they were exempt from taxes for a period of 6 years after that line had been constructed. Most of the railroads didn't pay any taxes because all they had to say is, we're not finished yet. And we may be building more. So they got 6-year extensions repeatedly. Okay, that's the background, and believe it or not, all this relates to Native American railroad workers. The railroads had reoccurring needs. They needed land for the right-of-way, for town sites, and for the yard maintenance office for all their trains. They needed water for the locomotives and the workers, and they needed wood, at first for fuel before they switched over to coal, and then for ties. There were some railroading responsibilities that the railroad could take care of. They could take care of the engineering, the construction, and the manpower. And this is where the native workers come into play. First came the surveyors. The surveyors walked the entire distance from Kansas City or Independence, Missouri, or wherever they started out, to San Francisco or Los Angeles, surveying, carrying those heavy wooden tripods, their surveying glasses that they needed, the notebooks, all of that stuff by foot, and hammered in stakes to mark the right-of-way. After these guys came the workers, and the workers consisted of various ethnic groups. The Southern Pacific, because it was based in South California, hired a lot of Asian and Chinese workers. There were relatively few Chinese workers in New Mexico, with the exception in the Lordsburg, Deming, Silver City area. And the Union Pacific, north of us, hired Native Americans. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe focused on Navajos, on Pueblo people, and on local Hispanic people that were here as well. The first step in getting the railroad built was preparing the alignment. And there were plow gangs, and they actually used mules and a guy behind it with a steel plow marking that right-of-way. They had to clear debris out of the way. They had to move boulders as best they could. They filled arroyos, and they were building bridges to get that done. It was dangerous work, and it required teamwork and everybody working together. That's one reason that a lot of these crews were not mixed. They were either all Navajo, all Laguna, all whatever, because whoever was in charge of that group had to be able to tell his workers what to do, and if there was some kind of a dangerous situation, like a rock was falling or something, everybody better understand what the guy was saying that noticed it.
Where's the red circle?
The red circle is, it's a track car, and I hadn't noticed it when I first found this photograph, but when I zoomed in on it, I saw it. I had wondered how they got, after they were laying track and they came to the end of the track, how do you get rail to the next place, and how do you get the ties there? Well, they got it there with this thing called a mule, and it's a little push cart that has 4 wheels on it. It looks like that. And it's loaded up either with rail or with ties, whatever you need. And as you lift the rail or whatever you're using off of it, it's pushed forward by hand by a couple of guys. And then you go back, and then they push it way back and load it up with more ties and rails and stuff. But that previous picture, it was showing how it actually works. There's more to building a railroad than most people are aware of, and I just wanted to give you an idea of all the work that these steel gangs did. After the ground was level, they needed to put down the ballast or the crushed rock so that when the ties were put on it, the ties would stay stable and not be shifting around or moving, because the tracks needed to remain in the exact same distance from one another as they were. That's called the gauge. The gauge that the Pacific Railway Act required all railroads to use was standard 56.5 inches wide. That's still used today. Narrow gauge, like the Chile line and other ones, I just wanted to say that the narrow gauge is 3 feet wide for a purpose. You can make tighter turns if the rail is closer together, and also if you're harvesting lumber in a place like the Lincoln National Forest or Zuni Mountains or someplace like that. After you've clear cut an area with narrow gauge, you can actually take that rail up and move it somewhere else. It's not as heavy as the standard railroad companies have. So anyway, and then the ties are put on top of the ballast. Then tie plates are put down so that the rail isn't cutting into the timbers. And then finally, a guy walks along the side of the track, either a Navajo or a Laguna, with leather pouches with spikes in them. Most of these ties were pre-drilled, so they only had to sort of place them in the pre-drilled hole, and a relative or somebody was going to be coming behind him with sledgehammers, pounding them all in. Everybody had a job to do, and the native people at that time were particularly good at repetitious jobs. Just do the same thing. You don't have to learn anything new. As far as you can see, for 6 miles, walk down that line and put spikes in those holes. That's all you have to do. Or if your job was to hammer them in, that's all you did. Or if your job was to shovel ballast, that's what you did. And they were good at it. And they were also used to the summer heat and the winters that are typical of northern New Mexico. Again, this is a close-up of track and rail. And on the inside part of that rail, you can see numbers, and that usually gives the weight of the rail. If you're walking along tracks now, you may notice that, and if it says something like 85, that means that rail weighs 85 pounds to the yard. It's not measured by foot, it's by yard. So those are the different requirements for ballasting. I want to talk first about the Navajo Railroad experience, and then I'll get into the Laguna experience. But this is a picture of Navajo people as prisoners at Bosque Redondo near Fort Sumner. If you need a Sunday trip that you think might be interesting, I highly recommend stopping at Bosque Redondo. It's been refinished inside as a museum, and it's just a marvelous place to really get a feel for what the Navajo and the Apache people went through when they were driven out of their own homes to that area and stayed there for, I think, 5 years. But there were several forced marches, and a number of people stayed there. A number of people died because of just a different environment and poor food and all kinds of horrid conditions. This is Chief Manuelito. He was the head of the Navajo activities under confinement, and the Navajo Treaty of 1868 is the first documentation of a relationship between the Navajo and the railroad. It's not a positive one. It's an admonition that was enforced by William Tecumseh Sherman, Civil War general that was in charge of Navajo activities at Bosque Redondo. There were 3 points that the Navajo were forced to sign and agree to. One, that they would make no opposition to railroads now being built or built into the future, that they would not interfere with the construction of any railroad, and they would not in the future ever oppose the construction of any railroad. In the late 1860s, 1870s, and 80s, Navajo men were beginning to think about wage jobs. They wanted money. They had a trading system that worked well on the reservation, but some of the younger men and women were interested in moving around and earning some wages. So they were looking for opportunity. This is a drawing of several Navajo people with a train in the distance, and I think it may have occurred to a number of them that the railroad may be the answer to needing money and getting away from the reservation if that was something they wanted to do. There was an interesting system for recruiting Navajo Railroad workers. At first, those workers probably just volunteered and made contact with any railroader that they happened to come in contact with and saying that they would like to work for the railroad. It became a little more formalized after the turn of the century. And a large part of that were the trading posts and the trading post operators. There was a triangle that existed really between the trading posts, between the federal agencies like the Federal Railroad Administration, the Railroad Retirement Board, and even the old Interstate Commerce Commission that had to sanction a lot of these railroad activities because the railroads were regulated by these federal agencies. And there were the railroad companies themselves, in particular the Santa Fe, the Union Pacific, and the Southern Pacific. But a railroader, track maintenance supervisor that needed a gang for some work would contact the trading post operator and ask him, telling him, next Saturday I need 60 men brought down to the main line for jobs. And the trading post operator would have a truck, flatbed truck or whatever, and bring those people down, and he would get a percentage of their wages for doing that. So that's how it started with the Navajo workers. The advantage for the workers were that they could move their culture with them to some extent. While it wasn't as good as staying on the reservation, there were some benefits. There were spiritual leaders that would visit them, like medicine men, or people that could help them with any of their physical or other kinds of problems they might have. They built sweat lodges along the tracks, and occasionally children and their wives would come and either visit the men or they would follow them and live wherever they could while the line was being constructed. There were mutual benefits for the railroad and for the Navajo. Let me just stay with the Navajo. There was a pretty good wage that Navajo men could make. Now we're getting back into the 1900s, 1920s, 1930s. The picture on the upper right is a group of Navajo track workers in one of the eating cars that the railroad would park at a siding. They had fairly good wages. They had travel. There was some family accompaniment. And they were also getting trained at jobs that would take them away from the reservation and give them a beginning of a wage. What the railroads got were self-disciplining crews. The crews were generally organized so that there was a head man that the railroads thought had more influence over some of the other workers. That wasn't always the case. The railroad was frequently mistaken as to who the most dominant individual was. And if somebody from the tribe really had more authority over them, nobody would work until that individual authorized it and said, yeah, go ahead and do that. They were well organized, they were good workers, and the other thing was that they tended to be competitive. If one group was laying rails or laying ties, the second group that was coming behind them wanted to move faster and to get the reputation of being the very best among all the workers. So the railroad loved the competitiveness. They loved the fact that they didn't pay any health insurance or railroad retirement at first for Native American people. So the railroad loved the cheap labor and the enthusiasm and the support of the Navajo. These are just some pictures that I have in my collection of Navajo railroad workers, just doing various jobs. Let me see if this is the, no. I was going to mention this later, but I'll just mention it now. What's important about this picture is what you don't see in it. What you don't see are steel-toed boots, gloves, reflective vests, hard hats, hearing protection, goggles, all the things that workers expect today. When you worked for the railroad in the early 1900s, you wore the clothes you had, and you were hired with what you showed up in. If you had a hat to protect you from July and August sun, you were lucky, but that was about all the protective gear you got. A lot of the pictures I got were from the Library of Congress, and there's a famous photographer, Jack Delano, a magnificent photographer of Depression-era pictures. And if you're interested in this subject, I would suggest looking for Jack Delano's work. The other good thing about it is there's no copyright on it. It expired, so if you have a publication you're working on or would like to use something, that's a great source, as the Library of Congress itself is. The pictures on the right side are crews carrying rail. Remember I said rail was 39 feet long because the car was 40? This shows these guys lifting rail, and I assumed that it was 90-pound rail, which was being used at the time. But when you calculate that out, each man is lifting about 117 pounds, but he's doing that all day. And they're lifting it off the mule, the little cart, and then moving it ahead and picking it up. And if something is wrong with the track, they've got to unspike the whole thing, lift it up again, fix the spikes, put it back down, all of that. So it was very arduous work. This is a picture of a Navajo section gang in Gallup, 1938. You can see in the back of the hotel, the Navajo Hotel. And it's quite an assortment of hats. But I just suspect the guy seated in the middle with a white Stetson is the boss. The Laguna Railroad experience was a little different, and it's fascinating. This is a map of the arrow showing Laguna on the state railroad map. Have any of you heard of the Flower of Friendship Agreement? Good. In 1880, the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad left Isleta, and its construction crews were building toward Los Alamos.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. The line needed to cross 40 miles of Laguna land, and Lagunas were able to halt that construction for negotiation. And in exchange for the privilege of building through Laguna land and using San Jose River water, the railroad agreed to employment of Laguna people for housing of the railroad workers and free rail passes for tribal members. The gentleman whose picture is there is a very important railroad official. His name is A.A. Robinson. He was the chief engineer for the AT&SF, and when the Laguna held up construction of the line, Robinson was in New Mexico working on other projects, and he was called to come to Laguna and approve the negotiation for the use of Laguna land and for the agreement itself. The agreement, it isn't in writing, it was a handshake, oral agreement, but it was still honored by the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe as recently as a few years ago, when the railroad used to send several business cars and a locomotive from Chicago out to Laguna to wine and dine Laguna people and railroaders that had worked on that. Principally because the Laguna were very good friends with the railroad during a series of strikes that had occurred, and social disruption. The railroad could always depend on the Laguna people, and they didn't forget it. This is a picture of the train going by Laguna. And Laguna had a history of being very accommodating to outsiders. Laguna at one point had a Jewish governor. It also had a mix of people there, and several of the railroaders that were involved with the construction of the Atlantic and Pacific ended up staying at Laguna and marrying Laguna women. Because of that, when the railroad was coming through and there was some discussion about whether they should stop it or object to it, those surveyors that were there conferred with the Laguna leadership and basically told them what to do and how that negotiation should be handled, so that when the railroad and when A.A. Robinson came, the Laguna leadership knew exactly what to do. That's how they cut the deal. The other thing that's significant is that as the railroad was coming down from Raton, it needed to pass through 6 other sovereign nations: Cochiti, Santo Domingo, San Felipe, Santa Ana, Sandia, and Isleta. None of those questioned or attempted to stop the railroad from building through the land. It was only at Laguna. And that may have been because railroad surveyors were there and felt very devoted and very appreciative of the hospitality the Lagunas had given them. As I said, the Laguna people could be relied on in all kinds of weather for whatever was necessary. There were 3 major railroad strikes, and the Lagunas were always willing and able to work, and they did. They worked not only for strikes, but washouts for bridges, derailments. If there was a wreck, weather issues, and track failures. So they were very reliable, and as I said before, even the Burlington Northern Santa Fe that merged with the defunct Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe still remembered it and still honored the agreement, even though it was not in writing. This is just one of the other strikes, a very famous one in 1922. There were several Laguna villages of railroad workers that were built between Albuquerque and California. They were in Barstow, they were in various other locations. I've got a map of them. But they were really boxcars that the native people were living in. One of the reports that I read was that the Acoma painted their boxcars green, and the Lagunas had red ones, but they were very friendly, worked very well together, and many of them were related by family. This may or may not be a Laguna boxcar village. It may just be a Depression era village, but it looked like that. And there still are people around that are very proud of the title Boxcar Baby. These were babies that were born in the boxcars. As a matter of fact, a person I've worked with in the past is the president now of Laguna Pueblo, Harry Antonio, and he is a boxcar baby. This is one of the libraries in some of the boxcars in the Richmond, California colony. And kids went to school in public schools in the area. Women did the shopping while the men were out on the job. And when they came back, if they were a section gang, they were just gone during the day, came back at night. And that's pretty much how it worked. This is an aerial photograph of the Barstow former Indian camp location, and it can still be seen. In the 1970s, as we get more current, there were a lot of changes in the railroad industry. First, these two documents are authorizations from the Department of Justice and from the Surface Transportation Board approving the merger of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe and the Burlington Northern, and then the other one is for the Southern Pacific, Union Pacific merger. And those occurred in the 1990s, I'm quite sure. But that period also saw a decline in the number of crews that were needed because mechanization was beginning to take over the railroad industry. And this is one of the trains that the Santa Fe Railway sent out for guest rides and meals for Laguna passengers and relatives that were part of the cruise. And in the Santa Fe Railway newsletter for employees, there was a nice article on keeping the flower of friendship alive, and that act of watering the flower is called the watering of the flower because it keeps the agreement going. It really represented a close of an era. I mean, we've gone from manual track construction to all kinds of sophisticated equipment for track now. And this is what you can see if you're driving on I-40 sometime. You can see those yellow track maintenance machines. Those have taken the jobs of what was formerly 200-man crews, and often there's one machine that is either changing out ties, and there might be 4 guys walking next to it. It's not unusual to see those pieces of equipment with air-conditioned cabs and a woman driving it. Today, if you want to get a job with the railroad, you go online like anybody else does. You fill out the application and wait probably for several months before you hear back from anybody. But that's how it's it's pretty well done now.
Yeah.
These are the references, and I gave somebody the papers on that, but if you want to look or read any of these things, these are really great sources that has additional information. And then there are a couple of people I wanted to thank. This is where I got a lot of my data from interviews from people and conversations that I've had with other folks. And I'm sure if you're interested in this, they'd be happy to talk to you too. That's it.
Are you writing a book?
I got a manuscript done, but I'm never done with it. Any questions? Ma'am?
What were the wages at that time for the Navajo and the Laguna worker?
What?
The wages,
I'm hesitating because I don't know, but I'm sure it wasn't much.
it was.
Yeah.
Less than this family, keepers less than yours.
When was the track built from Belen going out to like Clovis? Because that's Burlington, Santa Fe track.
Yeah, that is, and it was Santa Fe Railway Company that did it. I think it was shortly after 1880, probably 1885, 86.
Okay, I didn't see it on one or two of your maps, and I was wondering what happened, you know, it poofed. Where was the Transcon came later?
I'm not sure. I'll look at one of those maps. If you want, we can talk about it.
That track work is extremely dangerous, and there must have been horrible injuries occasionally. Was there any medical provision at all from the railroad, the workers, or did that just up to the families take care of an injured worker?
The families, by and large, took care of injuries or deaths. There's a story I read about one of the railroad workers that made it all the way through like 20 years with the railroad without being injured. But he mentions in that his sister, he remembered his sister saving a white sheet to wrap his remains in if he ever needed it, and was killed during railroad work because there were no facilities, there weren't any company doctors, and that's one reason that the Navajo brought with them medicine men or spiritual advisors that were usually accompanying them on a lot of the track work. Ma'am?
Yeah, I had a question that was similar to the, like, I wondered if they had death benefits. But also you were saying before that you weren't sure if they had insurance at all, like health insurance or any kind of health benefits at all. But did the whites, did the Caucasians as well?
No,
I don't,
nobody did until the unions appeared,
which was when?
and during the Theodore Roosevelt and the trust busting
Yeah.
and the progressive era is when the unions came in and started demanding those kinds of protections for workers.
And weren't the natives union? They weren't allowed to be union, the native workers, the different Indian populations?
Probably not. Ma'am?
Could you explain, you said the 90-pound rail, is that 90 pound or 90 ton? I don't, explain that term, 90-pound rail.
When you, rail is measured in pounds per yard.
Oh, per yard.
Per yard. So if you want to know how much 39 feet weighed, you would have to
Okay.
divide it by 3 to find out what it is by foot. And that's why it comes out with 10 guys lifting 39 feet of 90-pound rail. Every man was lifting 117 pounds.
Right.
Okay, and then a kind of related question. Skyrail, doesn't George R. Martin and Company still own Skyrail, or they're still trying to sell it? No, they're not trying to sell it.
I don't know what the current
Oh,
thing,
but you kept.
but he bought it and developed it, and prior to his doing it, it was, well, let me go back.
So
This may be more than you want to know, but I'll be brief. In let's see, in the 1992, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe still owned that little branch line that goes up from Levy to Santa Fe. They were in the process of getting rid of, I think, 60 other branch lines throughout the country that were bleeding them white. They were going bankrupt, and that's why they eventually merged with the Burlington Northern. There was a public meeting hosted by the railroad asking if anybody in the public or private sector was interested in purchasing this line, because if not, we're gonna pull up the tracks and the ties and sell them to landscaping companies, and that right-of-way is gonna revert back to adjacent landowners. You never be able to put it back together. Two people stepped forward with as little railroading experience as they had money and said they would be interested in buying it. So they bought the line for something like $250,000. The Santa Fe Railway felt sorry for them and threw in a locomotive and an engineer to show them how to drive it. That little company called Santa Fe Southern operated the train for 20 years. A guy named Bob Sarr, that was an executive with Procter & Gamble, thought it'd be fun to run a train. He's since moved to Colorado. But they kept it going for 20 years, and they gave rides, and they hauled a little bit of freight, and they did what they could. Finally, they gave up the ghost, and it was for sale again. Enter George Martin. And that's what it needed, somebody with imagination and money, both of which he had. And Sky Railway, as I understand it, is doing very well now. They have all kinds of little excursions. They have shoot 'em up cowboys and Indians robbing the train. They have karaoke trains. They have a wine tasting train. They have an Easter train, a Christmas train, a Santa Claus train, you name it. So they're doing quite well now. Sir?
Fred, my dad had an Indian trading post near Gallup in the late 30s and 40s. There's a good chance that the picture of 1938 at Gallup was maybe that he furnished some of the people that were there.
I'll be darned. What was the name of the post?
Mariana Lake,
Hmm.
about 30 miles from Gallup.
So,
You must have some good pictures.
Not really, of course, yeah.
Well, that's what I had, so thank you very much for attending.
right.